The landing craft lurches forward, its hull groaning and complaining beneath the pressure of the sea. For the men crouched in its belly, there's nothing to do but wait. Wait and hope for a safe passage to the shore. Spumes of water and foam flow over the bow, soaking the men, and then all hell breaks loose. The rattle of machine gun fire and terrible crash of explosives. The landing craft is thrown left and right, but keeps on. They must be near the landing site now. The gate is about to come down, exposing all of them to the fury of what lies on the other side. The men have their objectives. They know what they have to do, and they pray they have the strength to do it. Anyone who knows about the Normandy landings, particularly those at Omaha in June of 1944, will recognize this situation. The Omaha landings are among the most famous in history, if not the most famous, and for good reason. This was a turning point for the war in Europe, a huge victory for the Allies with an enormous human cost. But equally, this scene could come from somewhere else. It could come from the Pacific campaigns, where American Marines and infantry conducted a program of island hopping as landing after landing brought them ever closer to Japan. Today, we're telling those stories and looking at just what made these Pacific beach landings so deadly. I should mention, you can fly famed World War II Pacific Theater warplanes in War Thunder, the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made. The vehicles in War Thunder span over 100 years of development from the 1920s all the way to now. Each one of those vehicles are incredibly detailed and modeled down to their components, offering players a highly immersive combat experience. Play for free on PC, Xbox and PlayStation, and experience thrilling and dynamic combined arms PvP in the 2,000 tanks, planes, helicopters and ships. You don't need any fancy equipment to pilot, you can just use your mouse and keyboard. Best part? War Thunder offers incredible graphics and detail in 4K resolution, along with authentic sound effects and beautiful music, creating an atmosphere to fully immerse yourself in. War Thunder also has one of the most dynamic and detailed vehicle damage models in gaming, basically showing players what the actual damage to their vehicle is. As someone who loves playing War Thunder on the PS5, this is one of my favorite things, being able to see exactly which component was damaged or which crew member was actually hurt. For a limited time only, new players, as well as those that haven't played for 6 months or more, can claim a large bonus pack which includes multiple premium vehicles, premium account features, an exclusive 3D decorator for your vehicles, and so much more. Play War Thunder now for free using our link below. The Americans were working backwards from their ultimate goal. To cross the Central Pacific and reach Japan, the Philippines must be retaken, but to get there, the Marianas must fall. The Mariana Islands were heavily defended, but could be taken if the US controlled the Marshall Islands. An assault on the Marshalls might be possible if there was an unbroken line of communication from Hawaii, but there was not. Between Hawaii and the Marshalls, there was a Japanese base, Bateo, on the western side of Tarawa Atoll. If this whole house of cards were to come tumbling down, the Americans must first land at Tarawa. Hope was high when, on November 20th, 1943, 18,000 Marines began their assaults on the tiny Bateo Island. Almost immediately, these hopes were dashed. Along the island's north coast, the water wasn't as deep as expected, and the landing craft found themselves snarled against the jagged coral that ringed the island. As the Marines tried to free their craft, the Japanese guns on Bateo opened up, tossing landing craft like toys and inflicting heavy casualties on the invaders. Still hundreds of meters from the shoreline, the Marines knew they had only one option. They jumped into the shallow water and began the grim trudge toward the beaches, through water that reached chest height and under devastating enemy fire. Many would never even set foot on Bateo. But many did. As the lagoon approach became choked with Allied dead and shattered landing craft, it became clear that men and material were making it through. Amphibious assault vehicles, better equipped to deal with the conditions than the landing craft, were making their way to the beaches. By the end of the first day, 5,000 Americans were on Bateo, but hundreds lay dead in and around the lagoon. These few hours were some of the bloodiest experienced by the Americans in the war. The second day of the assault on Tarawa did not get much easier. Once again, The tide was low, and the Marines who had already landed were largely unsupported. Snipers rained down fire on the stranded troops from all directions, and the situation looked grim. But noon brought higher tides, and the reserve wave of Marines and tanks began to make its way ashore. Destroyers were able to close in on the island, supporting the men with artillery fire. Finally on the move, the Marines made rapid progress across the island, knocking out gun emplacements and enemy positions with grenades and flamethrowers. For many, this would be the first experience of their enemy and his tactics. Banzai charges and suicide missions were repeatedly used to counter the Americans. On the night of November 22nd, a final cry of banzai rose into the darkness. The remaining Japanese defenders launched a desperate assault on the invaders. By morning, the Battle of Tarawa was over, 76 hours after it began. The Americans had given up 1,000 lives to take the island. All but 17 of the 2,636 strong Japanese garrison had perished. Including Japan's civilian construction workers and Korean prisoners, their death toll ran to almost 4,700. Before Iwo Jima and Okinawa entered the public consciousness, Peleliu was the landing of the amphibious campaigns in the Pacific. Almost 10 months after Tarawa, the US war effort in the Pacific was progressing, but at a heavy cost. The orchestrators of this campaign, General Douglas MacArthur of the Army and Admiral Chester Nimitz of the Navy, were undecided on what to do next. MacArthur, who had promised to return after leaving Corregidor at Manila Bay in 1942, was pushing for the recapture of the Philippines and move from there to Okinawa. Nimitz was advocating for something more mobile, taking Taiwan and Okinawa by bypassing the Philippines altogether. While the two commanders butted heads over this, they were in agreement over one thing. For either plan to be a success, the island of Peleliu, in modern-day Palau, had to be taken. At a little after 8:30 on the morning of September 15th, 1944, the 1st, 2nd, 5th, and 7th Marine Regiments landed on two beaches at Peleliu. The Japanese defenders were ready, and the Marines were met with a barrage of fire from both flanks. After less than an hour, 60 landing craft had been destroyed. While the Marines were at least on the beaches, they weren't going anywhere fast. Attempts to move inland were thwarted by stiff resistance, and by the end of the day, the Marines held their landing sites and nothing more. They were clinging onto Peleliu, but only just. The second day went a little better for the Marines. Reinforced by further landings, they pushed inland, and the American forces were in control of Peleliu airfield by September 17th. Elsewhere, however, troops were still getting torn apart by fierce resistance. At the point, the southern end of the landing sites, and at Bloody Nose Ridge, the Marines fought hard to dislodge the defenders, often resorting to hand-to-hand combat to keep themselves in the fight. The 76 hours the Marines spent securing Tarawa must have felt like weeks, but on Peleliu, they stretched into months. Finally, 2 months, 1 week, and 5 days after the landings, Peleliu was completely in American hands. It had cost the Americans around 2,000 lives, with 8,500 wounded. The Japanese lost more than 12,000 men. Despite the agreement of both MacArthur and Nimitz that the attack must go ahead, some historians believe the bloodshed on Peleliu was unnecessary. It may have been possible to knock out Japanese air power in the area using the Americans' own planes, effectively stranding the Japanese garrison as the main Marine force swept by en route to the Philippines. Whether or not this is truly the case can never be known for sure. While the US Armed Forces did learn from the mistakes of the landings at Tarawa, this was still a bloody chapter in the march across the Pacific. The words Iwo Jima are etched deeply into the modern understanding of the American campaigns in the Pacific. The battle that raged here for more than a month in the spring of 1945 has become synonymous with the horror, bloodshed, and dogged determination of the US Army and Navy's route to Japan. This, the first time the American and Japanese militaries clashed on Japanese soil, would see the stars and stripes flying at the island's highest point, and give us one of the most famous photographs of the war. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. As landing craft closed in on the island on February 19th, 1945, the men aboard would have known that they had a stiff task ahead of them. But up until now, resistance had been minimal. The Imperial Japanese Navy was reeling after years of devastating combat in the Pacific, limping back and back toward home territory. There was no way they could prevent a landing, so the garrison on the islands would just need to hold out. The officer in command, General Kuribayashi, had a plan. He would lie in wait, permitting the first wave of Marines to make landfall. Then he would make his move. Compared to the landings at Peleliu and Tarawa, the going was good for the Marines. The bluffs and scrubland overlooking the beaches were silent as the Americans filed ashore, organizing themselves into squads and platoons. The artillery bombardment to soften Iwo Jima up ahead of the assault must have worked. Then, at around 10 AM, a great fury was unleashed upon them. At first, it came as a ragged rattle of machine gun bullets, soldier, diarist, and author Robert Leckie would recall, growing gradually lower and fiercer until at last, all the pent-up fury of 100 hurricanes seemed to be breaking upon the heads of the Americans. Shells screeched and crashed, every hummock spat automatic fire, and the very soft soil underfoot erupted underfoot with hundreds of exploding landmines. Marines walking erect crumpled and fell. Concussion lifted them and slammed them down or tore them apart. With Kuribayashi now unleashing his delayed barrage on the men on the beaches, everything began to fall apart. The first wave had been promised excellent beaches with solid, stable sand to advance across. This turned out to be untrue, and vehicles quickly became bogged down as the terrain collapsed beneath them. Hundreds of Marines fell under a hail of bullets and artillery shells, and every inch of ground was hard fought for. As troops began to move off the beach, they cleared bunkers and trench complexes, only to find these positions springing into action once again at their rear, remanned by Japanese soldiers in a labyrinth network of tunnels dug into the island. It took 4 days for the Americans to isolate the Japanese troops on Mount Suribachi and then take the island. But they still had northern Iwo Jima to contend with. Here, General Kuribayashi remained in command, overseeing a formidable set of defenses. Understanding that his task was now to delay the American advance as much as possible, with no hope of reinforcement or relief, Kuribayashi forbade the banzai charges and suicide attacks that had become such a big part of last-ditch Japanese warfare. Still, by the time northern Iwo Jima fell, 5 weeks after the initial assault, there were only 216 Japanese prisoners out of a garrison of more than 20,000. The Marines suffered terribly on Iwo Jima. As many as 6,102 were believed to have been killed across the 5-week campaign. But at least, the Americans had a vital airfield to the south of Japan. Well, this is up for debate. The airfield did enable long-range fighter escorts for bombing raids over Japan, but it took so long to subdue Iwo Jima that this was hardly necessary by the end. Only 10 of these missions flew from Iwo Jima. However, the island proved invaluable as an emergency landing point for B-29 crews, yet the assault on the islands remains a controversial action in the Pacific Island hopping campaign. As the 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marines celebrated a grim victory on Iwo Jima, the 1st, 2nd, and 6th, along with 4 infantry divisions, were preparing for the next link in the chain that led to Japan itself. Less than a week after victory had been declared on Iwo Jima, the assaults on Okinawa began. Known as the Typhoon of Steel, the war's final major battle, and one of its bloodiest, was unfolding. Like Iwo Jima, there was little initial resistance. Marines began to mass on the beaches, nervously awaiting the fury that was surely coming to them. However, unlike Iwo Jima, that fury did not come. Marine and infantry troops headed inland, crossing the island and cutting it in two. For days, there was little to no response from the Japanese that the Americans knew were waiting for them, until on April 6th, a counterattack began. By now, kamikaze attacks were not the baffling events they had been several months earlier. They were expected. Some 350 kamikaze fighters, along with Bako-guided missiles with a kamikaze pilot strapped inside, rained down upon the Allied fleet off Okinawa. They were supported by the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. The idea was to crush the fleet and isolate the troops on the island, ready for annihilation. It was a failure. As the Yamato sank beneath the waves on April 7th, it took with it the era of big gun naval warfare. At sea combat would never be the same, and the Japanese defenders were effectively all alone. The month of May dawned with the Japanese in a dire situation. Their forces were now concentrated in a 230 square kilometer zone in the extreme south of the island. However, they still had 60,000 men, the overwhelming majority of whom were preparing to fight until the very last. At Chocolate Drop Hill, Nahashuri, and countless other locations, the Japanese made stand after stand, drawing the invaders into brutal fighting in awkward and unforgiving terrain. Whether dug into caves in the hillside, guarded by concrete fortifications, or holed up in civilian homes in towns and villages, the Japanese resisted the American advance. Even after their primary fortification, a formidable line between Naha on the west coast and Yonabaru in the east, was broken, the Japanese refused to give ground. It took until June 21st, almost 3 months after the initial landings, to subdue the island. Those landings had been relatively straightforward, but from then on, the situation was desperate. Between April 4th and May 26th, the line advanced only 4 miles. It took another 4 weeks to advance the remaining 10 miles to the island's southern tip. Across all the Army, Marine, and Navy regiments involved in the struggle for Okinawa, as many as 12,500 Americans were killed or missing, a simply staggering loss of life. For the Japanese, it was even worse. At least 77,000 Army regulars lost their lives, along with 33,000 conscripted from the local Okinawan population. Around a quarter of the civilian population of Okinawa perished in weeks of carnage. The last meaningful Japanese force in the Pacific was destroyed, and now the Americans had their eyes on Japan itself. The Normandy landings took place over 5 beaches: Gold, Sword, Utah, Juno, and Omaha. It's Omaha that's the most famous, largely because this is the focal point for the carnage the day is now associated with. At Gold Beach, on June 6th, the British forces landing there took 400 casualties, putting 25,000 men ashore. At Sword, the British landed 29,000 men with 630 casualties. Utah saw the fewest casualties, 197 men out of 23,000 landed. Meanwhile, Juno saw the landing of 21,400 Canadian and British troops with 961 casualties. At Omaha, a number of factors meant events took a very different turn. 1. The Omaha landings involved a Ranger assault on Point du Hoc, essentially a special operation that was very different to the task of getting men ashore. 2. The naval bombardment, it was later argued, did not sufficiently weaken the German defenses. Men at Omaha were deposited into the teeth of a dragon, and many would be cut down where they stood. The rough seas at Omaha made it difficult for the landing craft to reach the beaches, and some were swamped before they got within range. In total, there were around 2,400 casualties, but 34,000 troops made it ashore. We can't compare the horrors experienced by the men who made these landings or by those who resisted them. We can barely even begin to imagine what that day must have felt like for those involved. But we can, from a historical perspective, examine the cost of these landings. The landings at Tarawa and Peleliu, for example, were met with an intensity equal to or even greater than that encountered by the first wave at Omaha. The number of lives lost at Tarawa in such a short space of time is almost unmatched in any other American operation of war. The opening day's action at Peleliu resulted in 1,100 casualties, of whom 200 were dead. This is less than half that of Omaha, but the ongoing advance onto the island would see this number increase tenfold. Iwo Jima was a little different. Here, The Japanese sprung a trap for the Americans, allowing them to land almost unopposed and then opening up on them. This was only the beginning of one of the bloodiest battles of the war and one of the most costly engagements in the history of the Marine Corps, but the nature of the Japanese response and the lack of casualty data from those horrifying opening hours make comparisons difficult. If Iwo Jima was slightly different to what had gone before, Okinawa was a world away from the actions at Omaha or even Peleliu in the Pacific Campaign. Here, the Marines were allowed to make landfall and even advance for days before the counterattack began in earnest. The numbers lost by both sides on Okinawa are staggering and are far in excess of the Allied and Axis casualty figures at Omaha, but the defensive strategy was completely different. We should avoid getting too bogged down in the idea of worst or bloodiest. All these actions were horrific in their own right and for their own reasons. What's important is that the hardships endured and the sacrifices made by soldiers on both sides are remembered. Most of these actions have had some kind of Hollywood treatment. Clint Eastwood made films from both the American and Japanese perspectives at Iwo Jima. Hacksaw Ridge, starring Andrew Garfield, focused on the Battle of Okinawa. The acclaimed miniseries, The Pacific, covers the landings at Peleliu in one episode. Despite this, it's still easy for the lens of history to shift and for events to become muddled and confused. The famous Saving Private Ryan has given younger generations some insight into what occurred in Normandy on June 6, 1944, and was praised by veterans on its release. More than a quarter of a century after it first screened, this remains a touchstone for younger people trying to make sense of events that are rapidly fading from living memory. But it's not the only example of a courageous landing and a desperate defense. World War II transformed amphibious warfare, and we owe it to those present to remember the way in which these battles were fought. Omaha must not be forgotten, but nor should the other amphibious actions that took place during the war, often at enormous cost. As always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new. Massive thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring the video. To experience epic World War II PvP battles in planes, tanks, ships, and much more, be sure to head to the link in my description and take advantage of the large bonus pack War Thunder is offering, including multiple premium vehicles, premium account features, the 3D vehicle decorator, and much more.